Picture this: Mount Rainier, Maryland, January 1949. A winter night so cold the windows frost from the inside. In a modest suburban home, a 13-year-old boy lies in bed, listening. Always the scratching. It comes from inside the walls, from beneath the floorboards, from nowhere and everywhere at once. His parents stand in the doorway, watching their son's bed shake. They are educated people. They do not believe in ghosts, but the mattress is moving and no one is touching it. The doctors came first, then the psychiatrists. They measured, tested, observed. Picture this: Mount Rainier, Maryland, January 15th, 1949. A Saturday night, cold enough that frost creeps across the window panes like skeletal fingers. You are lying in bed in a modest 2-story house on Bunker Hill Road, and you hear it. Scratching. Not the scratch of a mouse in the walls or branches against glass. This is deliberate, rhythmic, as if something with claws is trying to get in. The boy heard it first. 13 years old, slight for his age, with dark hair and eyes that had not yet learned to hide fear. His name has been protected for 76 years, buried under pseudonyms and legal agreements, but the church records call him Roland. He lay in his bed on that winter night, listening to the sound that had been following him for 3 weeks. It started the night his Aunt Harriet died. You know this story. You have seen the movie. The spinning head, the green vomit, the crucifix used as a weapon. You know it as The Exorcist, the film that made a generation afraid of their own bedrooms. But that is not this story. This is not Hollywood's version, sanitized and dramatized for maximum shock value. This is the documented case that psychiatrists could not explain, that doctors witnessed and could not rationalize, that the Catholic Church investigated with clinical precision before authorizing what they had not done in America for centuries. This is the story of a boy who became a battleground, and the desperate attempt to save him from something that should not exist. Before we descend into this darkness, I want to ask something of you. Where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? I ask because this story happens at night, in the hours when the rational world loosens its grip and older truths emerge. If you believe these documented cases, these moments when the line between the explainable and the impossible dissolves, deserve to be examined with honesty and respect, then take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Your support allows us to keep opening these files, to keep the light burning on the stories that institutions would prefer stayed buried in archives. Tonight, we will walk through the front door of that house on Bunker Hill Road. We will meet the family who tried everything the modern world offered before they were forced to consider the unthinkable. We will examine the medical records, the psychiatric evaluations, the testimony of doctors who watched phenomena they could not explain, and we will trace the path that led from a grieving boy playing with a Ouija board to a case that would change the Catholic Church's approach to spiritual intervention forever. This is not about belief. This is about documentation. This is about what happens when every rational explanation fails. Welcome to Echoes of the Old World. Roland Doe was not his real name, but it is what history remembers. He was an ordinary boy in an ordinary suburb. His father worked for the government. His mother kept house. They were Lutheran, church-going but not obsessive. The kind of family that said grace before dinner and attended services on Sunday without making religion the center of their lives. They were rational people living in a rational time. America in 1949 was looking forward, not back. The war was over. The economy was growing, was solving mysteries that had plagued humanity for millennia. There was no room in this world for the supernatural. but Aunt Harriet believed. She was a spiritualist, a woman who attended seances and insisted that the dead could be reached through concentration and the right tools. She was Roland's favorite relative, the one who listened to him, who treated him like an adult. She taught him how to use the Ouija board, that simple piece of wood with letters and numbers and a planchette that supposedly moved under the guidance of spirits. She promised him that even after she died, she would find a way to contact him, to let him know she was still there, still watching over him. She died on January 12th, 1949, a Wednesday. Roland was devastated. He had lost the one person who understood him, who made him feel special. That night, alone in his room, he pulled out the Ouija board. He placed his fingers on the planchette. He called to Aunt Harriet. He begged her to give him a sign that she was still there, that death had not taken her completely. Something answered, but it was not Aunt Harriet. The scratching started that night, faint at first, almost ignorable. Roland told his parents. His father checked the walls for mice, examined the radiator pipes, looked for any rational source of the sound. There was nothing. The scratching continued. It grew louder. It moved from room to room, always following Roland. When he slept in his parents' room, the scratching came with him. When they moved him to the living room, the sound followed. Then the bed started moving, not shaking, as if someone were jumping on it. Moving, sliding across the floor while Roland lay in it, as if pushed by invisible hands. His parents watched it happen. They were not hysterical people. They were not prone to fantasy. They watched their son's bed scrape across the hardwood floor and come to rest against the far wall. And they could not explain it. They called a doctor. The doctor examined Roland. Physically, the boy was healthy. No fever, no signs of illness, no neurological abnormalities. The doctor suggested anxiety, grief manifesting as psychosomatic symptoms. He prescribed rest. The family tried. The phenomena intensified. Objects began to move, not during moments of high emotion or activity, but during quiet times, when the family sat together trying to pretend everything was normal. A chair would slide away from the table. A picture would fall from the wall. A vase would tip over, slowly, as if guided by an invisible hand. Roland's parents documented these events. They were not believers in the supernatural, but they were thorough people. They kept notes. They invited witnesses. Family friends came to the house and watched objects move with no one touching them. The scratches appeared next. Roland would wake in the morning with red marks across his chest and arms, thin lines as if drawn by fingernails. The marks would appear while his parents watched, rising on his skin like invisible claws were dragging across his body. The doctors had no explanation. Stigmata, one suggested, then dismissed the idea as impossible. Roland was not Catholic. He was not particularly religious. There was no psychological mechanism that could produce physical wounds that appeared without touch. February came. The family was desperate. They had consulted doctors, psychiatrists, neurologists. They had searched for every rational explanation. Every expert who examined Roland left with questions they could not answer. The boy was healthy. The phenomena were real. Multiple witnesses had documented them. Medical professionals had observed them firsthand. And nothing in their training, nothing in the accumulated knowledge of modern Ikiyi could explain what was happening in that house on Bunker Hill Road. Roland's behavior began to change. The quiet, gentle boy became violent during episodes. He would speak in voices that were not his own, deep and guttural, saying things a 13-year-old Lutheran boy from suburban Maryland should not know. He spoke phrases in Latin, a language he had never studied. He demonstrated knowledge of private conversations he had not witnessed. And through it all, the scratches continued to appear on his skin, words forming in languages the family could not read. The Lutheran minister came to the house. Reverend Luther Miles Schulze observed the phenomena. He attempted prayer. He tried to counsel the family. And then, in a moment that would change everything, he suggested something that rational 1949 America was not prepared to hear. He suggested that this might be a case requiring intervention beyond what Protestant Christianity could offer. He suggested they contact the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church, unlike most Protestant denominations, had retained the ancient rites, the ceremonies of the formal procedures for confronting spiritual possession. The word was not used lightly, possession. It came from a different era, a time when demons were considered as real as disease, when the spiritual and physical worlds were understood to intersect in ways modern had dismissed. But Reverend Schulze had witnessed what was happening to Roland. He had seen phenomena that violated every natural law he understood. And he knew that the Catholic Church, for all its traditions that Protestants had abandoned, had maintained protocols for exactly this situation. Protocols that had been tested over centuries. Protocols that required documentation, investigation, and approval from the highest levels of church authority before they could be implemented. The Doe family faced an impossible choice. They were not Catholic. They did not believe in the rituals and ceremonies that Catholicism had preserved from the medieval world. But their son was suffering. Medical had failed. Psychology had offered no relief. And the phenomena were growing stronger, more violent, more focused. The scratching had become words. The words had become threats. And Roland, their gentle boy, was disappearing beneath something that should not exist. In late February 1949, the family made their decision. They would contact the Jesuits at Georgetown University. They would submit to an investigation by priests trained in theology and skepticism in equal measure. They would open their home to men who would document everything, question everything, and only proceed if every other explanation had been exhausted. They would ask the Catholic Church to perform ceremonies that had not been conducted in America in living memory. They would ask for an exorcism, not the Hollywood version, not the spinning heads and projectile vomit. The real ceremony, the ancient prayers, the systematic process of liberation that the Church had refined over 17 centuries of confronting the inexplicable. And what happened next would be documented in journals that the Church would lock away for decades. Written by priests who were sworn to secrecy, filled with observations that would challenge everything the modern world believed about the line between the natural and the supernatural. The scratching in the walls of that house on Bunker Hill Road was about to become a case study. The boy lying in that shaking bed was about to become the subject of one of the most thoroughly documented spiritual interventions in modern history. And the Catholic Church was about to authorize a process they had hoped never to use again, because the age of demons was supposed to be over, had won. The Enlightenment had triumphed. The supernatural had been explained away. But in Mount Rainier, Maryland, in the winter of 1949, something was happening that could not explain, and a 13-year-old boy was running out of time. The doctors arrived with certainty. They brought their instruments, their textbooks, their accumulated knowledge of the human body and mind. They believed in measurable phenomena, in cause and effect, in the fundamental principle that every symptom has a rational explanation. They left that house on Bunker Hill Road with their certainty shattered, carrying observations that violated everything their training had taught them to believe. Dr. Luther Schulze was the first medical professional to witness the phenomena directly. He was not just a minister, but a man with medical training, someone who understood the difference between hysteria and genuine physical manifestation. On the night of February 17, 1949, he sat in Roland's bedroom with a notebook, determined to document whatever was happening with clinical precision. What he recorded would become part of the official investigation that would eventually reach the Vatican itself. The bed moved, not vibrated or shook. It moved. Dr. Schulze watched the heavy wooden bed frame slide across the floor while Roland lay in it, the boy's body completely still. No muscular tension, no physical effort. The doctor examined the floor for tricks, for hidden mechanisms, for any rational explanation. The floor was smooth hardwood, no wheels, no tracks, nothing that could account for a bed moving on its own. He measured the distance, 14 feet. The bed had traveled 14 feet across the room in under 30 seconds. With a 13-year-old boy lying motionless on the mattress. Dr. Schulze touched the bed frame during the movement. He felt no vibration, no motor, no mechanical explanation for the motion. It simply glided, as if weightless, as if pushed by invisible hands. He documented the temperature of the room, 58 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to see breath, but the house was heated. The cold was localized, centered around Roland. The doctor placed a thermometer near the boy's body and watched it drop 15 degrees in less than a minute. There was no draft. The windows were closed. The cold had no source. The medical establishment was called next. Dr. E. Albert Hughes, a physician with 30 years of experience, examined Roland on February 22nd. His report, preserved in the church archives, describes a healthy adolescent boy with no signs of neurological disorder, no seizure activity, no physical abnormalities that could explain the reported phenomena. But Dr. Hughes did not rely solely on examination. He insisted on observation. He spent the night in the Doe household, watching, waiting, skeptical that anything genuinely unexplainable would occur in his presence. At 2:17 in the morning, he watched scratches appear on Roland's chest, not self-inflicted wounds. The boy's hands were visible, resting at his sides. The doctor was watching them. The scratches appeared anyway, thin red buns rising on the skin as if drawn by invisible claws. Dr. Hughes documented their pattern. They formed letters, capital R, capital L. The doctor photographed them. The photographs survive, locked in church archives, showing marks that appeared without physical contact, witnessed by a medical professional who had no explanation for what he was seeing. Dr. Hughes attempted every rational test. He checked for allergic reactions, for dermatographic urticaria, for any medical condition that could cause the skin to mark itself. Roland had none of these conditions. The scratches appeared in patterns too precise to be random, too controlled to be psychosomatic. And they appeared while the boy was being observed by someone trained to spot deception. Someone who had spent 3 decades diagnosing the tricks the mind can play on the body. Dr. Hughes left the house at dawn. His official report concluded with a single devastating sentence: "I can find no medical explanation for the observed phenomena." The psychiatric evaluation came next. Dr. Rhine, though not personally involved in the case, his work at Duke University in parapsychology had established protocols for investigating claims of supernatural phenomena. The priests who would eventually handle Roland's case consulted his methodology. They brought in psychiatric professionals trained to distinguish between genuine mental illness and other causes. The psychiatrists expected to find schizophrenia, early-onset psychosis, or elaborate attention-seeking behavior. They found none of these. Roland underwent standard psychological testing. His intelligence was normal. His emotional responses were appropriate. He showed no signs of dissociative disorder, no evidence of the fractured personality that might explain the different voices witnesses reported hearing. The psychiatrists noted something strange. During the episodes, Roland's voice would change completely, dropping to a register impossible for a 13-year-old boy, speaking in languages he had never studied. They recorded these episodes. The recordings were analyzed by linguistic experts who confirmed that the voice was speaking Latin, specifically ecclesiastical Latin from the medieval period, with pronunciation patterns that had not been used since the 14th century. How does a boy from suburban Maryland, with no religious education beyond Sunday Lutheran services, speak medieval Latin? The psychiatrists had no answer. They tested for fraud. They separated Roland from any possible sources of information. They interviewed him extensively. The boy could not explain what happened during the episodes. He had no memory of speaking Latin, no recollection of the violent outbursts that witnesses described. He was, by all measurable standards, a normal adolescent experiencing something that normal psychology could not explain. The phenomena escalated under observation. Objects moved in the presence of multiple witnesses. A pitcher of water floated across the kitchen and emptied itself onto the floor. A crucifix flew off the wall and struck the opposite wall with enough force to dent the plaster. These events were witnessed by doctors, by family friends, by neighbors who had come skeptically and left shaken. The witnesses were not hysterical. They were educated, rational people, and they could not deny what they had seen. The medical community began to fracture. Some doctors insisted on neurological explanations, proposing rare seizure disorders or electromagnetic sensitivity, but the tests showed nothing. Brain scans were normal. Blood work was normal. Every medical instrument available in 1949 said that Roland was a healthy boy. Yet the phenomena continued, documented by professionals who risked their reputations by admitting they had witnessed events that should not be possible. Dr. Howard Haynes, a psychologist, attempted hypnosis. He theorized that Roland might be accessing buried memories, perhaps traumatic experiences that manifested as physical phenomena through unknown psychokinetic mechanisms. The hypnosis sessions were documented. Under hypnosis, Roland's personality remained consistent. There were no hidden traumas, no repressed memories. But something else emerged during these sessions. When Dr. Haynes attempted deep regression, Roland's body would react violently. His temperature would spike, his pulse would race, and the voice would emerge. The deep guttural voice that spoke Latin and said things that made the doctor end the session immediately. What did the voice say? The doctor's notes are carefully worded, but the message was clear. The voice claimed to be something other than Roland. It demonstrated knowledge of Dr. Haynes's personal life, private information the boy could not possibly know. It described events from the doctor's childhood, conversations he had never shared with anyone. The voice did this not to convince, but to threaten, to demonstrate power, to make clear that whatever was speaking through Roland's body had access to information beyond normal human knowledge. The scientific method requires repeatability. The phenomena were repeatable. They occurred in the presence of multiple trained observers. They were documented with photographs, audio recordings, written reports from medical professionals. Every attempt to explain them through known failed. The doctors ruled out epilepsy, ruled out psychosis, ruled out fraud. They were left with observations that violated the fundamental assumptions of their profession: that the physical world operates according to consistent, measurable laws. By early March 1949, the medical community had reached the limit of what it could offer. Roland's condition was not improving. The episodes were becoming more frequent, more violent. The boy was losing weight, sleeping barely 2 hours a night, showing signs of severe physical stress. But the stress had no medical cause. His body was failing under the assault of something that medicine could not measure, could not treat, could not even properly name. The final medical report, compiled from the observations of 4 doctors and 2 psychiatrists, concluded with clinical language that barely concealed its desperation. The professionals recommended that the family seek intervention beyond the scope of medical. They did not use the word exorcism. They did not need to. They had documented phenomena that rational could not explain. They had witnessed a boy suffering from something that existed outside the boundaries of their understanding. And they were honest enough to admit that they had failed. For all its power, for all its victories over disease and ignorance, had met something it could not explain. The instruments were useless. The theories were inadequate. The accumulated knowledge of centuries of medical practice had no answer for a 13-year-old boy whose bed moved on its own, whose skin marked itself with invisible claws, whose voice spoke languages he had never learned. The doctors had done their job. They had investigated, documented, tested, and in the end, they had to acknowledge that this case required tools they did not possess, knowledge they did not have, intervention from a tradition they had thought obsolete. The Catholic Church was contacted. The medical files were forwarded, and in the offices of Georgetown University, Jesuit priests began to review evidence that would force them to open archives they had hoped to keep closed. The age of demons was supposed to be over. But the medical documentation said otherwise. And the Church, ancient and experienced in matters the modern world had forgotten, prepared to respond. It began with grief. That is always how these stories start. Not with malice or curiosity, but with the most human of emotions. The desperate need to believe that death is not the end. Roland loved his Aunt Harriet more than any other adult in his life. She listened when others dismissed him, treated his thoughts as valuable when others saw only a child, and when she died on January 12, 1949, something broke inside him that no amount of rational comfort could repair. Aunt Harriet was a spiritualist. In the 1940s, spiritualism was not the fringe belief it would become in later decades. Millions of Americans attended seances, consulted mediums, believed that the barrier between the living and the dead was permeable if you knew the right methods. The movement had gained massive popularity after the First World War, when countless families sought contact with sons who had died in foreign trenches. By 1949, it had become almost respectable, a peculiar but accepted practice that existed alongside mainstream religion. Harriet had introduced Roland to the tools of her belief. The Ouija board was her favorite, a mass-produced piece of wood with letters and numbers painted on its surface. A heart-shaped planchette that would slide from letter to letter, supposedly guided by spirits. To modern eyes, it seems like a harmless game, a piece of Victorian parlor entertainment that toy companies would eventually market to children. But Harriet treated it with reverence. She taught Roland the proper way to use it. Fingers resting lightly on the planchette, mind open, questions asked with respect and clarity, she made him a promise. She told him that when she died, she would find a way to reach him. She would prove that death was not an ending but a transition, that love could survive the dissolution of the body. she would give him a sign. This promise, made with love and absolute sincerity, would become the doorway through which something else would enter. The night of her funeral, Roland could not sleep. The house was quiet. His parents exhausted from the day's grief and ceremony, he went to his room and pulled out the Ouija board that Harriet had given him. He placed it on his lap, positioned his fingers on the planchette, and called to her. He asked her to show him she was still there, still watching over him. He begged for the sign she had promised. The planchette moved. Roland felt it slide beneath his fingers, drifting across the board with deliberate purpose. It spelled out words, simple at first. Hello. Here. With you. The boy's heart soared. His aunt had kept her promise. Death was not the end. She could still reach him, still communicate across the barrier that separated their worlds. He asked questions. The planchette answered. He felt comforted, less alone, validated in his grief. But the answers began to change. The tone shifted from warm to cold, from comforting to threatening. When Roland asked if his aunt was happy, the planchette spelled out words that chilled him. Trapped. Help me. They won't let me go. The boy, only 13, did not understand that something had happened, that the door he had opened was not showing him his aunt, but something else entirely, something that had learned to mimic her voice. He used the board every night. The sessions grew longer, more intense. The entity communicating through the board began to make demands. It wanted Roland to do things, small things at first. Stay up all night, skip meals, ignore his parents. The boy obeyed, believing he was helping his beloved aunt escape whatever torment she described. He did not realize he was being conditioned, prepared, slowly surrendering his will to something that was learning to control him. The scratching started on the 4th night. Roland was alone in his room, hands on the Ouija board, when he heard it. A sound like fingernails on wood, coming from inside the walls. He asked the board if his aunt was making the sound. The planchette moved to yes. He asked why. It spelled, to prove I am real. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It moved around the room, circling him, as if something was pacing inside the walls, impatient, growing stronger. Roland's parents heard the scratching too. They investigated, found nothing, dismissed it as pipes or rodents. But the sound followed their son. When he moved to a different room, the scratching moved with him. When they took him to stay with relatives, the scratching appeared in that house too. It was not coming from the walls. It was coming from wherever Roland was, as if he had become a beacon for something that could not exist, but did. The boy's behavior changed. He became withdrawn, sleeping during the day and waking at night. His parents noticed dark circles under his eyes, a pallor to his skin that no amount of sunlight seemed to cure. When they asked what was wrong, he would not answer, or could not. He had promised the entity on the Ouija board that he would not tell anyone about their conversations. This secrecy, this isolation, was exactly what it wanted. It needed him alone, disconnected from the people who might intervene. 3 weeks after Harriet's death, the physical manifestations began. Roland woke one morning to find scratches on his arms, thin red lines that had not been there when he fell asleep. They were too precise to be self-inflicted, too uniform to be accidental. His mother saw them and panicked. They took him to a doctor who could find no explanation. The scratches continued to appear, sometimes while Roland was asleep, sometimes while he was awake and visible. his hands nowhere near the marks forming on his skin. The entity was making itself known. It had been patient, taking its time, slowly increasing its presence in Roland's life. The Ouija board sessions had given it permission, given it a foothold in the physical world through the boy's open willingness to communicate. Now it was strong enough to manifest directly, to mark his body, to make its presence undeniable. And it was no longer pretending to be Aunt Harriet. Roland tried to stop using the board. He hid it in his closet, pushed it under his bed, eventually threw it away. It did not matter. The connection had been established. The door had been opened. The entity did not need the board anymore. It had Roland. At night, lying in bed, the boy would hear the voice, no longer filtering through spelled-out letters, but speaking directly into his mind. It was not his aunt's voice. It was deeper, older, carrying a weight of malice that terrified him. The bed began to move. Not every night, but often enough that Roland dreaded sleep. He would lie rigid, eyes wide in the darkness, feeling the mattress shift beneath him. Sometimes it would shake violently, as if an earthquake localized to his bed. Sometimes it would glide across the floor, carrying him with it, moving with such smoothness that it seemed to float. His parents witnessed these movements. They could not deny them. Their rational worldview was crumbling. February brought escalation. The entity was no longer content to manifest through scratches and moving furniture. It wanted more direct control. Roland began to experience episodes where he would lose time, waking from a fugue state with no memory of what had happened. His parents would describe behaviors he could not remember, speaking in different voices, displaying knowledge he should not possess, acting with violence completely contrary to his gentle. During one episode, witnessed by his mother, Roland spoke in a voice that was not his own. It was deep, resonant, adult. It spoke in Latin, a language the boy had never studied. His mother did not understand the words, but she understood the tone, mocking, cruel, triumphant. The voice said things about her marriage, about private moments that no one else should know. Then Roland collapsed, and when he woke, he remembered nothing. The family was spiraling into chaos. The father, a rational government worker, tried to maintain normalcy, insisting that there must be a logical explanation. The mother, watching her son deteriorate, knew that logic had failed. Roland himself was trapped in a nightmare where he could not trust his own body, where hours would vanish and he would wake to find evidence of actions he could not recall. He was losing himself, piece by piece, to something that had answered when he called to his aunt. The Ouija board had been a doorway. Grief had been the key. And something ancient and patient had been waiting for exactly that combination. A vulnerable boy, desperate for connection, willing to open himself to whatever might answer. It had pretended to be Harriet, just long enough to gain entry. Now it was inside, and it was growing stronger. By late February, Roland was barely sleeping, barely eating. His weight dropped. His skin took on a grayish pallor. His eyes, once bright with curiosity, had become hollow, haunted. The thing using his body was consuming him from within, and every attempt to break free only seemed to strengthen its grip. The medical professionals had examined him and found no physical cause. The psychiatrists had interviewed him and found no mental illness. But everyone who spent time with the boy could feel it. Something was terribly, impossibly wrong. The spiral had begun with love, and ended in possession. A 13-year-old boy who had only wanted to hear from his aunt one more time had instead invited something else into his life, something that had no intention of leaving. And as March approached, as the phenomena intensified beyond what any rational person could deny, the family faced the truth they had been avoiding. Medical had failed. Psychology had no answers. They needed help from a tradition older than authorizing, from men trained to confront what the modern world insisted could not exist. They needed the Church. The Catholic Church does not take these matters lightly. This is not the Church of Hollywood exorcisms, where priests rush into battle armed only with crucifixes and holy water. This is an institution that has survived 2 millennia by being careful, skeptical, and methodical. When the Doe family contacted Georgetown University in late February 1949, they were not met with immediate acceptance, but with the cold precision of institutional investigation. Father E. Albert Hughes received the initial request. A Jesuit priest, educated in both theology and the scientific method, Father Hughes embodied the Church's dual approach to claims of spiritual possession. He was trained to believe in the reality of demonic forces, but he was also trained to eliminate every possible natural explanation before considering supernatural intervention. His first response to the Doe family's plea was not sympathy, but interrogation. The Church had protocols. These protocols existed because history was littered with cases of supposed possession that turned out to be epilepsy, mental illness, fraud, or mass hysteria. The Catholic Church, for all its mysticism, had learned through painful experience that most claims of demonic activity were nothing of the sort. The criteria for considering a genuine case were strict, outlined in the Rituale Romanum, the official manual of prayers and ceremonies that dated back to 1614. Before any ceremony of liberation could be authorized, every other explanation had to be exhausted. Father Hughes began his investigation by reviewing the medical documentation. The reports from Dr. Schulze, Dr. Hughes, and the psychiatric evaluations were thorough and troubling. Multiple trained observers had witnessed phenomena that violated natural law. The documentation was not hysterical or vague, but precise, measured, clinical. Father Hughes, reading these reports, recognized something that made him contact his superiors immediately. This was not a case of religious fervor or medieval superstition. This was modern medicine admitting defeat. The Church sent investigators, not just priests, but men trained in psychology, theology, and the careful art of distinguishing genuine phenomena from elaborate deception. They interviewed the family separately, looking for inconsistencies in their stories. They spoke with neighbors, teachers, anyone who had contact with Roland before the phenomena began. They were searching for evidence of abuse, of family dysfunction, of any environmental factor that might explain a boy's breakdown. They found nothing. The Does were ordinary people living ordinary lives until January 12th changed everything. The investigators observed Roland directly. They spent nights in the house, watching, documenting, maintaining the skeptical distance that their training demanded. What they witnessed matched the medical reports exactly. The bed moved with no physical cause. Objects displaced themselves while multiple witnesses watched. Scratches appeared on Roland's skin, while his hands were visible and motionless. The investigators documented these events with the same clinical precision the doctors had used, and they reached the same uncomfortable conclusion. Something was happening that natural could not explain. But documentation was not enough. The Church needed to establish that Roland was not suffering from a known psychological condition that might present with unusual symptoms. They brought in their own psychiatric consultants, priests who were also trained psychologists, men who understood both the human mind and the theological framework for spiritual intervention. These consultants spent hours with Roland, administering tests, conducting interviews, observing his behavior during both normal periods and episodes. Their findings were disturbing. Roland displayed no signs of schizophrenia, no evidence of dissociative identity disorder, no markers for any recognized mental illness. During episodes, however, his personality changed completely. He spoke with knowledge he should not possess, demonstrated linguistic abilities he had never learned, and exhibited a consistent secondary personality that was hostile, intelligent, and distinctly separate from the boy's normal consciousness. The psychiatric consultants concluded that whatever was manifesting through Roland did not fit any known model of mental illness. The church investigators documented specific incidents that met the criteria outlined in the Rituale Romanum. Roland spoke in languages he had never studied, specifically Latin and traces of Aramaic, ancient forms of these languages that even scholars rarely encountered. He demonstrated knowledge of private information about the priests investigating him, details of their lives that no one outside their immediate circles could know. He displayed physical strength during episodes that far exceeded what a malnourished 13-year-old boy should possess, requiring multiple adults to restrain him. Most significantly, Roland showed what the church classified as an aversion to sacred objects. When presented with blessed items, when prayers were spoken in his presence, the boy would react with violence and distress completely disproportionate to the stimulus. This reaction was consistent and repeatable, occurring even when Roland was not consciously aware that the objects were blessed or the prayers were being said. The church investigators noted this carefully. In genuine cases, the entity manifesting through the victim reacts to spiritual intervention in ways that psychological conditions do not. By mid-March, the investigation had consumed 3 weeks. The church had documented over 24 incidents of phenomena that could not be explained naturally. They had eliminated mental illness, fraud, environmental factors, and mass hysteria. The medical community had provided documentation supporting the family's claims. Multiple witnesses, including trained professionals from both secular and religious backgrounds, had observed the same phenomena independently. The case met every criterion the church required for considering spiritual intervention. But authorization for ceremonies of liberation did not come from priests alone. This decision required approval from the highest levels of church authority. The investigators compiled their reports and sent them to Archbishop Patrick O'Boyle of Washington. The Archbishop reviewed the documentation with advisors who specialized in these rare cases. They discussed the evidence, debated the conclusions, and considered the implications of proceeding. The Catholic Church in America had not authorized a formal ceremony of liberation in decades. To do so now would acknowledge that the age of demons had not ended, that the spiritual warfare the Church had been fighting for centuries was still active. Archbishop O'Boyle made his decision on March 28, 1949. The evidence was sufficient. The case met all criteria. The family was desperate, and the boy was deteriorating rapidly. The church would proceed, but with strict conditions. The ceremonies would be conducted by experienced priests under close supervision. Everything would be documented. The family would maintain absolute confidentiality. And the process would be conducted not as medieval superstition, but as systematic spiritual intervention, using prayers and ceremonies that the church had refined over 17 centuries. The decision was made, but it was made with full awareness of what it meant. The church was acknowledging that despite all the advances of modern despite the Enlightenment and the victory of rational thought, there were still realities that existed beyond the physical. There were still battles that medicine could not fight, phenomena that psychology could not explain, afflictions that required tools from an older tradition. The priests who would conduct the ceremonies understood they were stepping into territory that the modern world insisted did not exist. Father William Bowdern was assigned to lead the case. A Jesuit priest with decades of experience, Father Bowdern was chosen for his combination of spiritual strength and practical skepticism. He had spent his priesthood dealing with the messy reality of human suffering, not in abstract theological debates, but in hospitals, prisons, and homes where faith met the brutal edges of life. He was not a mystic seeking spiritual combat. He was a pastor who believed that sometimes the most loving thing the church could do was confront the darkness directly. Father Bowdern accepted the assignment with clear understanding of what he was undertaking. He reviewed the documentation, prayed for guidance, and assembled a team of priests who would assist him. They would follow the Rituale Romanum precisely, conducting ceremonies that combined prayer, scripture, and sacred rituals designed to sever the connection between Roland and whatever was manifesting through him. They would work systematically, night after night if necessary, until the boy was free or until they determined that nothing more could be done. The family was informed. The ceremonies would begin in early April. They would be intense, potentially lasting weeks. The family would need to be present to support Roland through what would be an ordeal for everyone involved. The church promised nothing except that they would try, that they would bring every tool of spiritual intervention they possessed to bear on this case. If it worked, Roland might be freed. If it did not, at least they would know they had exhausted every option, both medical and spiritual. The decision had been made. The investigation was complete. The authorization had been granted. Now came the hard part. The actual ceremonies of liberation, the systematic process of confronting what the modern world insisted could not exist. And in a hospital room in St. Louis, where the family had moved seeking better medical care, Father Bowdern and his team prepared to begin work that would last over 2 months and become one of the most documented cases of spiritual intervention in modern history. The priests kept records. This was not optional, but required by church law, a mandate from the Rituale Romanum itself. Every ceremony of liberation conducted by the Catholic Church must be documented with clinical precision. Date, time, location, witnesses present, prayers spoken, reactions observed. These journals were never meant for public consumption. They were internal documents, reports to be filed in diocesan archives and locked away, consulted only if similar cases arose in the future. But decades later, portions of these journals would surface, revealing details of a case that Hollywood could never fully capture. Father William Bowdern began his journal on April 18, 1949. The first entry is remarkably matter-of-fact, almost bureaucratic. He lists the location, Alexian Brothers Hospital in St. Louis, where the Doe family had relocated seeking better medical facilities. He names the priests assisting him, Father Raymond Bishop, who would help conduct the ceremonies, and Father Walter Halloran, a younger priest assigned to provide physical support. The entry notes the time, 9:15 in the evening. Then it describes what happened when they entered Roland's room. The boy was restrained, not with medieval chains or theatrical bindings, but with standard hospital restraints, implemented because during previous episodes, Roland had injured himself and others. Father Bowdern approached the bed and began the opening prayers, standard blessings from the Rituale Romanum. The journal records Roland's immediate reaction, violent thrashing, screaming in a voice that the priest describes as not belonging to a child, and the appearance of scratches on the boy's chest, forming words in Latin. The ceremonies would last over 2 months. From April 18th to June 20th, 1949, The priests worked nearly every night, conducting systematic prayers and sacred ceremonies designed to sever whatever connection had been established between Roland and the entity manifesting through him. Father Bodern's journal documents 30 separate sessions, though some sources suggest there were more that went unrecorded. Each session followed the prescribed format from the Rituale Romanum: prayers of protection, scriptural readings, direct commands for the entity to identify itself and depart. The journal entries reveal a pattern. The ceremonies would begin calmly, with Roland appearing normal, even cooperative. As the prayers intensified, as the priests invoked sacred names and read from scripture, the boy's demeanor would change completely. His voice would drop to an adult register, speaking in Latin phrases that Father Bodern, fluent in the language, recognized as medieval ecclesiastical forms. The entity would mock the priests, reveal private information about their lives, and demonstrate knowledge that Roland could not possibly possess. Father Halloran kept supplementary notes focusing on the physical aspects of the sessions. He was younger, stronger than the older priests, assigned specifically to help restrain Roland during violent episodes. His journal describes the boy's strength during these moments as impossible, requiring 3 grown men to hold him down. The priest documented instances where Roland would break through hospital restraints, where his body would arch backward in positions that should have caused spinal damage, where his temperature would spike to dangerous levels without medical cause. The journals document something Hollywood never showed: the toll on the priests themselves. Father Bodern's entries become shorter, more terse as the weeks progress. He describes exhaustion that goes beyond physical tiredness, a spiritual weariness that comes from night after night of confronting malice in its purest form. Father Bishop's health deteriorated during the ceremonies. The journals note several sessions where he could not continue and had to be replaced. Father Halloran, despite his youth and strength, describes moments of doubt so profound he questioned his vocation. But the priests persisted because they saw evidence that the ceremonies were working. The journals document a gradual weakening of the phenomena. Early sessions saw violent manifestations, objects thrown across the room, Roland speaking for hours in languages he did not know, physical marks appearing on his body. Later sessions showed less intensity, shorter episodes, longer periods where Roland seemed like himself. The entity was fighting back, but it was losing ground. The journals reveal details about the entity itself. During sessions, when commanded to identify itself, it would give different names, ancient names that Father Bodern recognized from demonological texts dating back centuries. The priests did not engage in lengthy conversations with these manifestations, following strict protocols that warned against being deceived or distracted. But the entity spoke anyway, claiming credit for historical atrocities, describing in detail the suffering it had caused over millennia. The priests documented these claims without endorsement, noting them as part of the phenomenon they were addressing. Father Bodern's journal entry from May 9th describes a turning point. During that night's ceremony, Roland suddenly became calm. He looked at the priests with clear eyes, his own eyes, and asked them to help him. He described being trapped inside his own body, watching it do things he could not control, hearing the entity's voice promising to never let him go. This moment of lucidity lasted only minutes before another violent episode. But it convinced the priests they were fighting for a real person trapped beneath the manifestation, not just combating an abstract spiritual force. The ceremonies intensified. The priests began conducting longer sessions, sometimes lasting until dawn. The journal entries from late May describe an escalating confrontation. The entity manifesting through Roland became more desperate, more violent, as if it understood it was running out of time. The scratches on Roland's skin appeared more frequently, spelling out threats against the priests, against the family, against anyone involved in the ceremonies. But the threats were becoming hollow. The entity's grip was weakening. Father Halloran's notes from June describe physical phenomena that defied explanation even within the context of spiritual intervention. He documented instances where Roland's bed would shake so violently that it moved across the floor despite being anchored. He described moments when the temperature in the room would plummet instantaneously, when their breath would frost despite it being summer. He witnessed objects moving on their own, always when prayers reached certain intensities, as if the spiritual pressure of the ceremonies was causing physical manifestations in the material world. The journals also document the prayers themselves, not the dramatic confrontations of Hollywood, but systematic recitation of scripture, psalms read in steady voices, invocations of sacred protection repeated hour after hour. The priests were not warriors brandishing crosses like weapons. They were conducting a ceremony refined over centuries, using prayers that millions had spoken before them, adding their voices to a spiritual tradition that stretched back through the ages. The power was not in theatricality, but in persistence, in the accumulated weight of faith expressed through words spoken with absolute conviction. By mid-June, the journal entries note significant improvement. Roland was having longer periods of normalcy. The episodes were less frequent, less intense. The entity's manifestations were becoming weaker, the voice less distinct, the physical phenomena less dramatic. The priests intensified their efforts, conducting ceremonies multiple times per day, sensing that the breakthrough was near. The journals describe these final sessions as almost anticlimactic compared to the earlier violence, more like watching something slowly release its grip than witnessing a dramatic confrontation. June 20th, 1949. Father Bowdern's journal entry for that night is remarkably brief. He describes conducting the standard ceremony, reading the prescribed prayers, making the traditional invocations. Roland became agitated, then calm. The boy spoke in his own voice and said a single phrase: "He is gone." The priests continued the ceremony for another hour, watching for any sign of the entity's return. There was none. Roland fell asleep naturally, without restraints, without distress. When he woke the next morning, he remembered nothing of the past 5 months. The final journal entry is dated June 21st. Father Bowdern writes simply that Roland appears to be himself, that the family has been counseled, that the case is being closed pending continued observation. The priest notes his own exhaustion, the relief of the team, and the profound weight of what they have witnessed. He ends with a prayer of thanksgiving, a request for continued protection over Roland, and a note that all documentation will be sealed and archived as per church protocol. These journals were locked in diocesan archives with strict instructions that they remain confidential. The priests who participated were bound by vows not to discuss the case publicly. But in the decades that followed, portions of the documentation surfaced. Researchers gained access to redacted versions. Witnesses who were present but not bound by clerical vows shared their memories. And slowly, the documented reality of what happened in that hospital room became known, revealing a case far more complex and thoroughly recorded than Hollywood's version ever suggested. The story was supposed to stay buried. The priests had taken vows of silence. The family had signed agreements with the church promising confidentiality. The medical records were sealed. The journals were locked in diocesan archives with instructions that they remain classified indefinitely. But secrets this profound have a way of escaping. spreading through whispers and half-remembered conversations until they reach someone who understands their power. In 1949, a young writer at Georgetown University heard fragments of a story that would change his life and transform popular culture forever. William Peter Blatty was a student when he first encountered the case. Not the full documentation, not the detailed journals, but rumors shared by Jesuit professors who had heard from priests involved in the ceremonies. The details were vague, deliberately obscured to protect the family's identity. But the core elements were there. A boy in the Washington area, unexplained phenomena, medical professionals baffled, a ceremony of liberation authorized by the church. Blatty, raised Catholic and fascinated by the intersection of faith and the inexplicable, filed the story away in his memory. 22 years later, he would write a novel based on that fragment of memory. But between hearing the rumor and writing the book, Blatty spent years researching, trying to verify details that the church refused to confirm. He tracked down witnesses, interviewed people who knew the family, gathered whatever scraps of information had leaked from the sealed case file. What he could not verify, he invented. The result was The Exorcist, published in 1971. A novel that took the documented reality of Roland's case and transformed it into something Hollywood could sell. Blatty made crucial changes. He changed the victim from a boy to a girl, Regan McNeil, making the possession feel more transgressive, more shocking to 1970s audiences. He added graphic elements that the actual journals never contained. The spinning head, the profane language, the crucifix scene that would make the film infamous. He created dramatic confrontations between priests and demon that bore little resemblance to the systematic, exhausting process documented in Father Bowdern's journals. He gave the story the arc of a thriller, with clear heroes and villains, building to a climactic sacrifice that never occurred in the real case. The novel became a massive bestseller. It spent 57 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, selling over 13 million copies. Readers were captivated by the combination of horror and faith, by the idea that the Catholic Church was still fighting battles against spiritual forces that the modern world insisted did not exist. The book touched something primal in the culture, a hunger for stories that acknowledged realities beyond the material, that suggested the supernatural had not been explained away by, after all. Then came the film. Directed by William Friedkin, released in 1973, The Exorcist became a cultural phenomenon unlike anything before it. Audiences fainted during screenings, people vomited in theaters. Some viewers reported experiencing panic attacks, spiritual crises, disturbing dreams that lasted weeks. The film grossed over $400 million, an astronomical sum for its time. It was nominated for 10 Academy Awards, and it permanently altered how American culture understood possession, exorcism, and the Catholic Church's role in confronting spiritual evil. But the film bore little resemblance to what actually happened in that hospital room in St. Louis. Hollywood needed shock value, needed moments that would traumatize audiences and generate word-of-mouth publicity. The systematic prayers documented in the journals became dramatic confrontations. The patient, exhausting work of priests became heroic combat. The ambiguous, uncomfortable reality of what happened to Roland became a clear narrative of good versus evil, complete with a sacrificial ending that provided catharsis and closure. The real Roland never saw the film. By 1973, he was a middle-aged man living under a different name, protected by the agreement he had signed with the church decades earlier. He had no memory of the events from 1949, a mercy that the ceremonies apparently granted. He married, had a family, worked an ordinary job. People who knew him described a quiet, private man who never discussed his childhood, who would leave the room if anyone mentioned exorcism or the Exorcist. He lived until 2020, dying at age 85, having spent 71 years never speaking about what happened to him as a 13-year-old boy. The agreement he signed with the church has never been made fully public, but its essence is known. In exchange for the church's intervention, for the resources and time devoted to his case, Roland promised absolute silence. He would never profit from his story, never give interviews, never confirm or deny the events that others claimed happened to him. This agreement was not unusual. The church routinely requires confidentiality in cases of spiritual intervention, both to protect the privacy of those involved and to prevent sensationalism that could damage the church's credibility. But The Exorcist made silence impossible. Once the film achieved cultural saturation, researchers began investigating its origins. Journalists tracked down the real case, identified the hospital, located witnesses who had not signed confidentiality agreements. By the 1990s, enough details had emerged that anyone interested could piece together the actual events behind Blatty's fictionalized version. Roland's real name remained protected, but everything else gradually became public knowledge. The location, the dates, the priests involved, the general outline of what occurred. The cultural impact was immense and complex. On one level, The Exorcist revitalized belief in the supernatural at a time when secularism was becoming dominant in American culture. Millions of people who had dismissed spiritual possession as medieval superstition suddenly wondered if perhaps the church knew something that modern had forgotten. Applications to seminaries increased. Interest in Catholic theology surged. The film, inadvertently, became one of the most effective pieces of evangelization the church never commissioned. But the film also created misunderstandings that persist today. Most people's conception of exorcism comes entirely from Hollywood, not from church documentation. They imagine violent confrontations, theatrical manifestations, dramatic moments of good triumphing over evil. The reality documented in the journals is far different. Systematic prayer, exhausting repetition, patient persistence over weeks or months, with success measured not in dramatic moments, but in gradual improvement. The church has spent decades trying to correct these misconceptions, emphasizing that most cases never require formal ceremonies, that spiritual oppression is rare, that the process, when necessary, is methodical and carefully supervised. The case changed church protocol permanently. The documentation from Roland's case became a reference point for all subsequent investigations. The church developed more rigorous screening processes, requiring extensive medical and psychiatric evaluation before considering spiritual intervention. They trained more priests in the procedures, recognizing that the modern world's skepticism meant cases would be scrutinized more intensely than in previous centuries. And they maintained the strict confidentiality requirements, understanding that public cases would inevitably be sensationalized and distorted. But the most profound impact was philosophical. Roland's case forced modern society to confront questions it thought it had answered. Can explain everything? Are there realities beyond the material? Does evil exist as an actual force, not just as human cruelty or psychological dysfunction? The documented evidence from the case, the testimony of medical professionals and priests, the multiple witnesses who observed phenomena that violated natural law, all of this suggested that the materialist worldview might be incomplete. The story refuses to provide easy answers. Skeptics point out that mass delusion can affect multiple witnesses, that psychological conditions can manifest in ways that seem supernatural, that the placebo effect combined with religious expectation could explain apparent success. Believers counter with the documentation, the testimony of trained observers, the physical phenomena that no psychological explanation adequately addresses. The case exists in that uncomfortable space between definitive proof and complete dismissal, challenging both rigid materialism and uncritical belief. What actually happened in that hospital room in St. Louis? The journals provide documentation, but documentation is not the same as understanding. Multiple witnesses observed phenomena that should not be possible. Medical professionals recorded events that violated their understanding of natural law. Priests conducted ceremonies that, according to their records, achieved results. But what those observations mean, what they say about the of reality, remains open to interpretation. The case proves nothing conclusively. It only asks questions that most people would prefer to avoid. Roland lived a long life after 1949. He never spoke publicly about his childhood. He raised a family, retired, grew old in peace. Whatever happened to him as a 13-year-old boy, he moved beyond it, built a normal life, found whatever happiness is available in this world. Perhaps that is the real ending. Not Hollywood's dramatic sacrifice, but a quiet man who survived something terrible and chose to live forward rather than look back. The priests who participated are all dead now. Father Bowdern died in 1983, Father Halloran in 2005. They took their memories to their graves, bound by vows they honored until death. Their journals survive, locked in archives, consulted occasionally by church officials investigating similar cases. The documentation exists, preserved, waiting for anyone with the authority and need to examine it. But it remains incomplete, written by men who understood they were witnessing something beyond their full comprehension. Recording observations, while knowing that observation is not the same as explanation. The Exorcist will endure as one of the most influential horror films ever made. Millions will watch it, experiencing manufactured fear in the safety of their homes. Very few will seek out the real case behind it, will read the medical reports or the fragments of priestly journals that have become public. Fewer still will grapple with what the case actually means, what it suggests about the of reality, about the limits of human knowledge, about the possibility that the material world we trust so completely might not be all that exists. The haunting never truly ended. It echoes through popular culture, through the ongoing debate between faith and skepticism, through every case the church investigates using protocols developed from what happened to Roland. It lives in the questions we still cannot answer with certainty. What happened to that boy? What did the doctors really witness? What did the priests confront in that room? And perhaps most unsettling of all, could it happen again? The scratching in the walls has become a metaphor, a cultural touchstone representing our collective uncertainty about what lies beyond the boundaries of scientific understanding. We are more comfortable now than we were in 1949, more confident in our mastery of the physical world. But the documentation from that case remains, preserved in archives, asking questions that our confidence cannot fully silence. And somewhere in the darkness, in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, the possibility waits that perhaps the modern world's certainty is itself a comfortable delusion, that perhaps there are older truths we dismissed too quickly, realities we explained away because acknowledging them would cost us the security we have built on the foundation of rational materialism. The case of Roland Doe reminds us that some questions do not have satisfying answers. Some stories do not end cleanly. Some truths remain uncomfortable no matter how much time passes. And that scratching you hear in the walls, that sound you dismiss as pipes or rodents or the house settling, might be exactly what you tell yourself it is. Or it might be something else. Something waiting for you to make the same mistake a 13-year-old boy made in 1949, opening a door and inviting in whatever answers. If you found value in this examination of documented history, consider subscribing to support our continued exploration of cases where the line between the explainable and impossible becomes dangerously thin. Leave a comment below. What do you think really happened to Roland? Was this genuine spiritual possession, elaborate psychological manifestation, or something we still lack the framework to understand? Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and be careful what doors you open in your grief. This has been Echoes of the Old World.